Okay, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Israel Defense and Diplomacy Forum podcast, or the IDDF as we like to call it. I'm Benjamin Anthony, and I'm very, very pleased to be hosted by Professor Chuck Freilich, former Deputy National Security Advisor in Israel, a professor at Columbia University in New York, and a professor at Tel Aviv University here in Israel, also an erstwhile long-standing member of the Belfer Center at Harvard University. Chuck, it's great to have you here. We've got a lot to talk about. First of all, how are you doing? How are you keeping?
I am well, and I hope you are too. Shana Tova. It's Gmar Chatima Tova. It's good to be with you.
Nice to be with you as well, and Shana Tova to you and all of our listeners, and let's hope for a wonderful year ahead and a meaningful fast for those who are going to be fasting, and perhaps a less tumultuous year, I think, would be a great wish for everybody who holds Israel close to their heart. Do you agree that that's a pretty low bar, but might we reach it? Might we fall short?
Well, it is a low bar, but I think if the Rabbeinu Shalom wants to be good to us, then he will give us a huge helping of boredom for the coming year.
Amen, amen. So Chuck, let's talk about what is on many people's minds, which of course is the trip that Prime Minister Netanyahu is in the very midst of right now to the United States of America. He's currently based over there at the United Nations. He's having a series of meetings with world leaders on the sidelines of the United Nations, none more important than his upcoming meeting with President of the United States, Joe Biden. And that meeting is in no small part expected to touch upon the idea and possibility of normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, brokered by the United States administration. And within that discourse, within that dialogue, within that formulation of normalization, there, of course, rears its head basically the parameters of accords that we are looking back on for the first segment of our podcast today, the Oslo Accords, which we are marking the 30th anniversary of. And I wanted you, please, to weigh in with a little bit of context about Oslo. We're not going to spend the entire program talking about it, but it is important. It is a seminal event in the history of the State of Israel and, of course, the Israel-Palestinian conflict. And the reason that this is relevant is because its legacy looms large. The Saudis who are talking about potential normalization, incidentally, a quick footnote there, there's now talk that normalization talks are off, but who knows? If the normalization is to go ahead, it seems to be that the Saudis are looking for some sort of what they've termed preservation of the conditions that will bring about a two-state solution. And those seem to be drawn roughly along the parameters of these accords. So why don't you kick off by telling us a little bit about those accords? There's no one better qualified than you to do so. So the floor is yours.
Well, first of all, I think it's very important to emphasize most people believe that Oslo was a peace agreement, and it wasn't. But just to remind people, September 1993, the process leading to the Accords was held in Oslo, but the signing ceremony was in the White House lawn. President Clinton, Prime Minister Rabin, and Shimon Peres was also there as foreign minister, and of course Yasser Arafat. And the rest of the process from there on was led by hosted by the U.S. By chance, it was held in Norway before then. But it wasn't a peace agreement. It was a framework agreement, a 5-year period that was designed to provide the framework for the negotiations that would lead to a peace agreement. And the end game was never spelled out. So the Palestinians say, "Oh, well, the end game was a Palestinian state," but it doesn't appear anywhere in the agreement. It doesn't say anything about the Palestinian claim to right of return. It doesn't say anything about borders, the future of the settlements, or the status of Jerusalem. They intentionally were all left open. Negotiations were only supposed to start within 2 years, but they were supposed to be concluded within 5. What did happen? Well, first of all, the two sides exchanged mutual recognition. The Palestinians recognized Israel's right to exist, renounced terror, repealed the PLO charter. It's questionable whether any of those two things actually happened. Formally, they did recognize Israel, but not clear that they really did. Israel certainly recognized the PLO as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. The Accords did provide for the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, which was to be established within 10 months and hold elections within 10 months. And the PA, the Palestinian Authority, was to have control over about 40% of the West Bank, the areas A and B, A where they have complete control, civil and military, B where it's just civil control. But if it was 40% of the territory, it was about, that translated into about 90% of the population. And of course, Arafat then became the president of the Palestinian Authority. Now, if you, those who have been following this, especially in the last few weeks, there's been an intense debate about it. And I just this morning, I saw a study which spoke of the disaster of Oslo. And I've seen others speaking of the success of Oslo. And I think both are overstated because the legacy is very, very mixed. It's certainly not a complete success. It's not a complete failure. It's somewhere in between. The Palestinians gained some measure of self-control over a significant part of the territory. They gained international recognition. But from their perspective, what led to the, let's say, to the argument that Oslo failed was the ongoing settlement in the West Bank. In the decade between the signing of the Accords and the following decade, the number of settlers in the West Bank doubled, from about 100 to 200,000. And the Palestinian claim was, well, what kind of peace agreement or peace process are you talking about when you're doubling the number of settlers? For Israel, the biggest success here was that we were no longer responsible for 90% of the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. It was both areas. And it was a critical step in terms of being able to preserve Israel's character as a predominantly Jewish and democratic state. For me, that was the critical outcome. It also provided for an economic bonanza because the Israeli economy absolutely took off afterwards because vast number of multinational corporations came into Israel following that. The period of the year or two before Oslo, the year or two after Oslo, you see a whole number of countries in the world, including some major players, Russia, Turkey, and India, all established relations with Israel a year or so before Oslo, but it was part of the peace process that was going on at the time, and others come afterwards. And then I think it paves the way, it's not directly related, but it paves the way then for the Abraham Accords and potential developments with the Saudis and others today. Now, if that was a success from Israel's point of view, the great failure was the terrorism. Because while we're talking peace, Arafat, if you want to be most generous to him, you say that he rode the wave of the Second Intifada. And if you want to be a little less generous, and I think actually more factual, he probably initiated the Second Intifada. Now, he's not the first leader in history to combine diplomacy with the use of violence, but this was totally unacceptable. This goes beyond any understandable combination. I don't want to say acceptable, but understandable combination of the use of force. 2,000 Israelis were wounded, 1,100 were killed in the Second Intifada. To put that in American terms, you multiply it almost by 40. So if for the Palestinians, the settlements killed the process, for us, it was terrorism that killed the process. It devastated the Israeli peace camp, which has yet to recover to this day, 20 odd years later. Also was a starting point. It wasn't an end. It got us to it led to the breakthrough so that we were talking directly with the Palestinians and talking with them about the critical issues. But unfortunately, if the process failed, it's because maybe the sides weren't sufficiently invested, and then Rabin was assassinated. And I think actually Yigal Amir didn't just kill Rabin, he killed the peace process. But we were talking about the critical issues and have been since then. We know what the two positions are. The question is whether we can go forward or not.
So I want to thank you for giving that overview and that context. Always, I do want to make a little bit of a disclaimer, Chuck, if I may. It's that I'm always someone who feels somewhat deferential to those who lived through the process as adults. I was really a child when the Oslo Accords were signed. It's something that I look back on. It's something that I do have vague memories of, surely. But I didn't live through it. I didn't experience, in other words, the euphoria and the sense of anticipation that many people had, good people with whom I disagreed politically and perhaps on policy, that they had, and that they were awash with, surrounding the idea that peace may yet come to Israel, between Israel and the Palestinian Arabs. So I do want to express that I don't know quite what it was to live through that period as somebody particularly engaged in policy, analyzing the politics of it. And it's important that people understand that you very much are somebody who went through that process, who knows that process. You're part of what you were part of what you described as the peace movement. That's something that's taken on almost disparaging tones today, wrongly so, in my opinion. There are people who dismiss it as some sort of insidious movement within Israel. I don't think that that's justified at all. The aspiration for Israel to know peace far outdates the Oslo Accords. It's part of the biblical yearning that the Jewish people have had since inception, just about. So with that having been said, I actually want to start with a question. There's an odd hijacking of the Oslo process, which is that suggests that Yitzhak Rabin, contrary to what you said during your introductory comments, actually did advocate very, very clearly and in very specific terms for the establishment of a Palestinian state. And in fact, he didn't do that. Tell us how you feel about that. Do you agree that that's been hijacked, that he's almost been put forward as the father of the idea of a Palestinian state next to the Jewish state? And do you agree that that's in fact a false narrative? And finally, what's the true narrative there?
Well, I agree with you. I think that is a false narrative. Rabin, Peres was a peacenik. Peres was a visionary, for better and for worse, by the way. His vision, one of his visions was establishing Israel's nuclear reactor in Dimona and building up the nuclear capabilities. He was one of the fathers of the entire defense establishment in Israel. He really was a visionary. And one place where I think his vision may have gone beyond what was realistic for his era was in this area. He spoke of the new Middle East. Today, maybe we're there, but we're there 30 years later. Rabin was much more cautious in his assessments. And I don't think there was actually euphoria. It wasn't a peace process with Egypt. It wasn't a peace process with the UAE, with Bahrain, Morocco. It was very, very mixed. Everyone had deep suspicions of Arafat. No one more than Rabin, who knew him personally. He knew him from years of reading intelligence reports about him. As a matter of fact, I think Rabin may have been even a bit too sour in his public statements. He never said that Oslo is going to lead to peace. He said it will give us a chance for peace. And I think you can credit him there as having been honest with the people of Israel. He always came back to that refrain. I think there is a possibility, there is a chance for peace, he would say. But if in democracies, normally when leaders want to sell a major new initiative, if anything, they get criticized usually for overselling. And I think he undersold, and that may have also had an impact on the final outcome. But, well, then Peres is elected, or not elected, come to think it replaces Rabin after he's assassinated. And that's the first, just 2 months after he takes over, is the 3 months, there's the first major wave of Hamas suicide attacks. And he goes from what the polls are showing, because the polls were so great that he, at the time, declared early elections. And you see literally in the space of 2 months, he goes from a dramatic win to what turned out to be a dramatic loss. So that's how that played out at the time.
So I still just want something a little bit more defined from you, if I can push you a little bit, because I do think that this is one of the misconceptions. You've spoken about the rhetoric or the lack of soaring rhetoric that Rabin assigned to the Oslo Accords and to that entire process. But I want to know from you how you feel it came about that Rabin became this symbol, posthumously, incidentally, this symbol of being an advocate and advocating for a state for the Palestinian Arabs, when in fact he never did that. Do you remember a particular point where that started to gain traction, falsely so?
Look, I think there's no doubt that when the process started, he was not thinking of a Palestinian state. He was thinking of less than that. And there's even some interesting information, at least new information for me, that says that he was considering a quote unquote reassessment of the whole process. And had he not been assassinated, might have done so a couple of months later. He was thinking of doing it apparently in January 95. He was a skeptic again of the entire process. I think in the course of the process, he moved closer to the idea of a state when he realized that less than that probably just wouldn't fly. And if he wanted to anything, he was going to have to deal with it. But it was going to be the most limited state that he could agree to. He was deeply skeptical whether Arafat was serious about the whole thing, I think with good reason. He was certainly skeptical whether, all right, let's say there could have been a deal and the Palestinian state would have been established, but he didn't think it was really going to live in peace with Israel, certainly as long as Arafat was around. Had good reason for really, really, goes beyond skepticism. It goes to, I don't know, what's the word that I'm thinking of revulsion is too strong a word, but I mean, his feelings towards Arafat were very, very pronounced. And for him, the whole process was really a test. And for the Palestinians, it was clear this is a process leading to a state, and the only question is how we get there. Some specifics, but it's about the process. For Rabin, it was very different. From day one, Oslo was supposed to test the Palestinians on two levels. One, can they put an end to terrorism against Israel? And secondly, can they take control of their destiny, establish an effective governing body that will deal with things domestically, that will work with Israel responsibly? And I think his feeling around the time of the assassination was that the Palestinians were failing or had failed on both levels. What happened afterwards is leaders who were assassinated tend to loom large in our memories. Look at Kennedy, who may not have been as great a president as one might think, looking at his public image subsequently. Rabin was a deeply revered leader in Israel. Even people on the right who maybe were happy to see that his policies were changed as a result of the assassination, but mourned his death deeply. Okay? This is a guy who had been a leader of the War of Independence, had been a chief of staff, the hero of the Six-Day War, then a minister, then prime minister. He was. There were songs about Rabin. He was part of Israel's founding narrative. And so when he was assassinated, maybe those on the center left wanted to attribute even more to him than he would have wanted to take credit for.
Well, it brought in a very interesting chain of events. You saw Rabin and the tragic assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. That then brings Shimon Peres to the position of prime minister. He then gets knocked off his perch by Bibi Netanyahu. Bibi Netanyahu then steps into the Oval Office with a new American president there who'd been there working with Yitzhak Rabin. Some say a great admirer of Yitzhak Rabin. You said that Rabin was admired by the Israeli people. He also had an onlooking, engaged President Bill Clinton, who very much admired him and obviously, as we all recall, eulogized him with the immortal phrase "Shalom Chaver," goodbye friend, at his funeral. Mm-hmm. And Bibi Netanyahu and Bill Clinton end up clashing during their first meeting in the Oval Office around Clinton's what was perceived to have been strong interference in the Israeli election, very much vocally, clearly supporting Shimon Peres, because Clinton felt that Shimon Peres would bring forward and push forward and propel forward the legacy of Rabin. But when Bibi went to the Oval Office, Clinton actually held up his hands and said, yes, I did do that, but now you and I have to do a deal and work together. And he emphasized that he expected Netanyahu to implement the Oslo Accords. If you go back and look at the press conference of the two of them, following that meeting, Netanyahu highlights one particular point and theme, which is reciprocity, that if Israel is expected to implement the terms of the Oslo Accords, so too does Israel expect that the Palestinian Arabs will do the very same. And he's, of course, referring above and beyond everything else to the ongoing terrorism against Israeli civilians. It needs to be emphasized that this was against Israeli civilians primarily. And then ultimately, Netanyahu loses his support electorally. His government falls, and then you get Ehud Barak, his former commander in Sayeret Matkal. Ehud Barak becomes the prime minister. He embarks on a series of negotiations, again predicated upon the Oslo Accords. He then makes massive concessions to his Palestinian Arab interlocutors over there at Camp David. He is then challenged from a very potent figure from the Israeli right, Ariel Sharon. Ariel Sharon expresses that Barak has absolutely no right to offer the Palestinians all that he offered to them, and that he would oppose him. And Ariel Sharon's not known as being someone who doesn't manage to gain the objects of his desire and his focus, and he soon became the prime minister as a consequence of that. And that led into, because of the ongoing terrorism, that actually led into two significant events. The first was Operation Defensive Shield, when Sharon basically oversaw as prime minister. I think he was also holding the portfolio of Minister of Defense at the time. Am I correct? I think he was. I think he was, and even if he wasn't, it was de facto. When you have a prime minister like Ariel Sharon, he's going to be involved in matters regarding defense, and he oversees Operation Defensive Shield over there in Judea and Samaria. That is overseen by then Chief of Staff Shaul Mofaz, and you see the IDF really take the fight and take the battle against terrorism deep into the Palestinian Arab strongholds, particularly in Jenin, but not exclusively so. They surround the Muqatta, they cut off Yasser Arafat from all outside contact, and they ultimately withdraw, having cleared out that area of much of the contraband, much of the weapons, and many of the personnel who were responsible for launching this ongoing terror against Israelis. And another thing, the second thing that happened, I mentioned there were two things, was you saw Sharon start to move to erect the security barrier, which many people believe is a de facto border. It's roughly built along the lines of the 1948 armistice lines, roughly in approximate terms. It can be demolished, it can be moved. Incidentally, it's a very interesting topic for those who have time to go and look at how the Supreme Court adjudicated the pathway of that security barrier. But I mentioned the security barrier, Chuck, because you said at the start that the Palestinians, as part of the Oslo Accords, had to denounce terrorism. Of course, you also said that they never really did so. We do see Mahmoud Abbas say that he doesn't believe in violent means, at least in the Western press, when he speaks to the Western press. I've always felt that that's merely a consequence of the fact that because of that fence, he can't send out any violent dispatches that would terrorize the Israeli people by way of homicide bombings. And the final thing that I would say about all of this is I'm actually not somebody who laments the failure of the Oslo Accords. I think that I'm not telling you anything new here whatsoever. I think that Israelis living in Judea and Samaria is a blessed thing. I think it's an important thing. I think that it's an interesting contrast. The Israelis continue to build up life in that area. The Palestinian Arabs launched terror against Israelis and murdered innocents in the course of doing so, many innocents in the course of doing so. An interesting contrast there. One party is building families and communities. The other party is murdering people in the streets. The Palestinians being the party that's committing murder. And I also feel quite strongly that it's very positive that the state never came about in Judea and Samaria for the Palestinian Arabs, because, as you've agreed with me in previous conversations, I think that state would have ended up being a client state of the state of Israel in the best case scenario, a failed state in the worst case scenario, and it would, of course, have given topographical advantage to the Palestinian Arabs overlooking the lowlands of Israel. And I think, quite frankly, it would have given a very, very clear message to anyone and everyone who was looking on that when it comes to the states of Israel, everything is up for negotiation, even the very heartland of the Jewish state, which is, let nobody make any mistake about it, Judea and Samaria. So I'm very pleased the state didn't come about. What I lament about the Oslo Accords, in addition to the many things that I've just rattled off, Chuck, is the fact that it still remains such an active part and quite frankly, an inhibitor to so much progress that may be made. For example, now we have the Saudis saying that, as I said at the top, preservation of the conditions for a two-state solution will be required for normalization. Some people believe that that's just lip service, but there's an interesting new little wrinkle there. The Oslo Accords brought about the nomenclature of areas A, B, and C, with Israel retaining full control over area C. Here we have this new wrinkle, which is the Saudis are now saying that Israel must withdraw from parts of Area C as well if they want normalization. I mean, it seems that the most recent negotiating position becomes merely the newest negotiating position to continue to advance into Israeli territory for anybody who wishes to do so. What do you say to that?
Well, first of all, let me just add to the recent wrinkles that you're talking about, is that President Biden just said a few days ago, he stressed that he will be talking to Netanyahu about a two-state solution. So that still very, very much remains on the books, not just for the Saudis and for the Israeli left, but actually for the entire world. One of the good things that's happened, let's say, over the decades in the post-67 era, is if Israel's existence, even in the pre-67 lines, was something that many states did not recognize until 67 and well after that, over the decades since that war, those lines have come to be accepted by virtually everyone, and including much of the Arab world today, as being Israel's legitimate borders. And the debate today is only over the West Bank and the Golan. It's not really anymore about Israel itself. Look, the Saudis can claim parts of Area C. There is some reason for that, because the Area B has become so totally overcrowded that there is spillover from B into C. Some of it, of course, is as part of the Palestinian effort to create the reality of a two-state situation. Part of it is just a natural spillover. It's not related to anybody's agenda. But in any event, I don't want to get into the whole issue of whether we want a two-state solution. We don't. I mean, obviously, you do not. I do. But I think...
By the way, I do, just not along those parameters. But
right.
I want a two-state solution without Israel ceding any land, yes.
Okay. Well, I don't think that there is a viable opportunity or option like that. Sharon can basically, for all of the fact that he certainly was not a leftist, he was not a peacenik, he in essence goes ahead with the Oslo or Camp David process. Camp David having been built, as you said, on Oslo. And then he leads to the disengagement. So we withdraw from Gaza. And for him, the disengagement, similarly to Oslo for Rabin, was a test. Okay, you failed the first one, we're giving you another opportunity. Here, now you've got Gaza, it's yours. In effect, it's a Palestinian mini-state or a sub-state. Once again, show us that you can put an end to terrorism, that you can govern responsibly. We're willing to go ahead in the West Bank as well. And as a token of good faith, Israel dismantles 4 settlements in the West Bank as well. Bibi, to this day, has never formally, officially renounced Oslo. His current government maybe yes, and if they've either said Oslo or they've said it in other ways that they're against the two-state solution, but until now, that wasn't the case. I think Abbas, he's certainly not has never been a courageous leader. And he has missed various opportunities along the way, important opportunities. But I do think that he did make a sincere change when it comes to terrorism. But Arafat actively sponsored it, supported it, financed it, gave it whatever assistance he could. Abbas has done his best actually to prevent it. And the Palestinian security forces have worked very closely with Israel over the last couple of decades since he took over to prevent terrorism. Where you can criticize him in this area is that he, in all of his public statements, and there have been many, he's always said that terrorism does not serve our cause, the Palestinian cause. He's never said that he condemns it on a moral level. It's just been a matter of the practical impact of it. The barrier, by the way, you're right that most of it follows pretty much the 67 lines, but it does incorporate about 10% of the West Bank on the the Israeli side of the fence.
So just a couple of quick points about that, and then I want to pivot to something else that's happened in advance of that sideline meeting between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu. So I've read much about Sharon's mindset, and it seems to be that Sharon wasn't really seeking to disengage from the Gaza Strip as a test, to bring about a test, but more to establish an exhibit that he could bring forward when pressed about Judea and Samaria and say, look, I withdrew from the Gaza Strip. Terror has ensued from that enclave. Now leave me alone about any further talk with regard to withdrawing from Judea and Samaria. It's not going to happen. Of course, we didn't get the chance to see whether or not that's accurate. Sharon fell victim to poor health. I think a series, or at least 2 strokes, one rather mild, which he was discharged from the hospital following soon thereafter, but one that actually plunged him into a comatose state for many years thereafter, prior to his demise. But I think that he brought about that disengagement to establish an exhibit, not really to run a test. I think he was pretty confident of what the outcome would have been there. And I think you would have probably seen a stronger military response to the terrorism and the rocket fire that emanated from the Gaza Strip had Sharon lived to implement his long-term policy there. But who knows? Maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong, but I definitely can see the logic behind the idea that he withdrew from there in order to buy the ability to turn around and say, don't talk to me about withdrawing from Judea and Samaria. It's not going to happen, particularly given what's going on in the Gaza Strip. And I, quite frankly, Chuck, I'm looking for a prime minister who will renounce the Oslo Accords. I think that it's high time that an Israeli prime minister stands up and says that he or she no longer sees any viability in the notion of the two-state solution and presents an alternative to that in the pursuit of peace. I believe that there are alternatives. We have to think creatively. You know well what my thought is about a particular policy, but thinking creatively does not mean dealing in fantasies. And I think that the two-state solution now, thankfully, is nothing more than a fantasy. I think it's a bad fantasy. And I'm very, very hopeful that we will move on from it being the policy prescription for peace between Israelis and the Palestinian Arabs, not least of which because it, at its heart, calls for any number of things that would be deleterious to the security of the state of Israel and to the place of the state of Israel upon the map, but also because it operates by this dreadful formula, which is land for peace. And on that note, let's turn, if I may, to this sideline conversation, because there is an interesting letter that has been published by, I believe it's 12 members of the Likud. So that's the party headed by Prime Minister Netanyahu, 12 members of the Likud who have said in advance of the meeting between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu that, and I'm quoting here, that they will only support peace for peace. They will not support any land concessions. So rather, I'm paraphrasing, not quoting. They will only support peace for peace, not land for peace, which is very interesting for a couple of reasons. The first reason is because it's coming from the Likud. One would expect those sorts of statements from members of Otzma Yehudit and also from, for example, Bezalel Smotrich, but they're coming from influential members of the Likud, namely Danny Danon, Israel's former ambassador to the United Nations and a major player within the Likud party, and also Yuli Edelstein, also a major player. What do you think about this? This is, of course, a preemptive strike against the idea of, as I've been saying so far, land for peace. You're surprised that the Likud members are writing open letters like this?
No. I think that in truth today, the difference between the Likud and the ultra-right parties is not that great. I think the Likud has become an ultra-right political party. It's, I think, like the far-right parties, become a semi-fascist and racist party. It's not the Likud of the past, which I never liked the Likud. I always thought that it was a misguided party, but it was a popular one, popular in the sense of representing a significant part of the base. Today, I think it has gone really far to the right. But I think they are trying to make clear to the prime minister that if he had any thoughts of making concessions on the Palestinian issue, that he can't do it. And that leads to a potentially major clash with the US, and it leads to a potentially major strategic loss for Israel, because what they're trying to do is say that one of the conditions for the breakthrough now between Saudi Arabia and Israel, the normalization of peace, is the Saudi demand that Israel make some sort of significant concession towards the Palestinians. And if Israel does that, and if the US fulfills their other demands, which are for a security treaty, for the ability to have a civil nuclear program and to enrich uranium, that's where the problem is, and for essentially unlimited access to American arms. Well, I must say I was quite skeptical that they could get the defense treaty, but there was a big write-up in the New York Times just yesterday indicating that it's actually going ahead and that they're looking at something like the U.S. defense treaties with South Korea and Japan, two of the, it's 5 or 6 bilateral agreements that have been signed over the decades. And the last time the U.S. signed a treaty like that was 1960. This is a very big move if the U.S. is willing to do it, to guarantee Saudi security. The U.S. has done it de facto over the decades, but to take on a formal responsibility such as that, especially today under a Democratic president who during the campaign called Saudi Arabia a pariah, and Saudi Arabia is very unpopular today in the Democratic Party, that's a huge move. The second issue, the enrichment one, I think there are technical ways of finessing the problem. It is still a big issue because if you allow the Saudis to enrich, then why shouldn't the Iranians, for example, enrich? So the problem here is maybe more political than substantive or technological. The arms, though, for the most part, I believe they'll get. But if Netanyahu can't make the concessions to the Palestinians, then the Saudis may not be able to go or willing to go ahead with this. For Biden, that would be a defeat, and he wants this whole thing to be. It won't affect the elections a year from now, but it would affect his standing in the short term. It would be a success. I think Biden is doing this first and foremost because he's simply deeply concerned about Israel. He wants to save Israel from itself on two levels. One is first and foremost in terms of the Palestinian issue, the demographic issue, and that's why he supports the two states. And secondly, he's hoping that if this goes through, then this government will either fall as a result, or there will be a new coalition formed. And maybe that's the greater hope, which would support this. And then this would be a dramatic strategic change in the Middle East. It would transform the Middle East, and we can go into that if you want in a second.
Well, with respect, firstly, let me just say this. I don't think it's President Biden's job to save Israel. I think President Biden's got more than enough issues on his own plate domestically. I think he's got far more pressing issues internationally, Ukraine, Russia being just two of those. And I don't know that the Israeli electorate really appreciates the notion, however well-intentioned it may be, of any president of the United States telling Israel that he is there in order to salvage and preserve the state. That's something that we're going to have to surely sort out domestically, and I'm very hopeful that we will do. The second thing is, I am actually very intrigued by this that's going on with these Likud members. I'll tell you why. I'm a Likudnik in my heart. I am, were I to be a member of a party, I would be a member of the Likud. But to your point, I would not be a member of the Likud today. I think that the Likud party of today is rather an embarrassment. I would be a member of the Likud, for example, during the epoch of Menachem Begin, as you and I have discussed offline. But you may be right to define it overwhelmingly as a party of the far right, but not these particular individuals, certainly not Yuli Edelstein. These are some of the more moderate characters there within the Likud. These are people who someone like Huchak will be looking to, hopefully, or with hope rather, based on the idea that they might oppose a further trampling of the judiciary here in Israel, that these are people who might launch a counter-campaign from within the Likud against further overrides of the judicial reform of the judiciary in Israel. I think it's not correct to say that this is de rigueur. I think that this is rather worthy of discussion. To have 11 or 12, and I can't remember the exact number, members of the Likud openly writing that if the Prime Minister, again, not members of Ben-Gvir's party or Smotrich's party, but openly writing that if the Prime Minister should make any moves towards land concessions, they will not support that and they will not accept that. I think that it shows that there is still among the sane right an opposition to the notion that land can be given away for peace. And I think that that's something that is worthy of discussion, well worthy of discussion. Do you still disagree? You still find it unremarkable that Yuli Edelstein's coming out publicly and saying against the Prime Minister that if you dare to do this, you won't have my support? I mean, he's a pretty powerful fellow over there in the Likud.
Well, I think Edelstein and Danon and the others who've been our hopes, ours in the sense of, let's say, people who take a more centrist or center-left approach, has not proven to be the case. They haven't done it to date, and they've had the occasion to prove themselves worthy of this. Edelstein, by the way, was the first person to not obey the Supreme Court when he was Speaker of the Knesset in his I think, pretty much his last official act as Speaker. I don't have a great deal of hope or respect for the people you're mentioning, but that's not the issue. What they're doing is they're taking the hardline right position. They're not saying, well, don't go too far, don't do this, don't do that. They're saying, don't make any land for peace concessions. So they're actually strengthening the far right when they do that. But I think, let's talk about what this whole issue means for Israel. If there is peace with Saudi Arabia is the heart of the entire Muslim world, Sunni or Shia. Everyone prays towards Mecca. Mecca and Medina are the holy cities for everyone. this is an opening not just to the much of the rest of the Arab world, and not just in essence an end to the Arab-Israeli conflict, at least with the Arab states, not with Hamas, Hezbollah, and certainly not with Iran, which isn't an Arab state. But it's in essence, it's the end of the conflict with the Arab states. And it not only opens up Saudi Arabia and with the Saudis, other Gulf states, it will open up Muslim countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, maybe Pakistan. And this is a huge difference for Israel. These are hundreds of millions of people. It's also their stamp of approval. Israel's position in the Middle East changes. It becomes legitimate to have ties with Israel. So I think this is something if it was that alone, we should view as a dramatic turning point, but it's also the basis for putting together the multilateral security architecture in the region that we've wanted for a couple of decades now. And the U.S. has even spoken about it for even longer. And now it would be critical against Iran. The Saudis and the UAE, who've been making nice to the Iranians for the last year or two because they've been afraid that they don't have the U.S. anymore, and Israel's so preoccupied with its turmoil, it's not even the partial replacement for the U.S. that they hope. This changes that picture. This lets us really build a joint security architecture. For example, a regional air defense system against the Saudis, against the Iranians, a regional alert system. If you want to think more optimistically, advanced positioning of Israeli capabilities, or at least access for advanced positioning. This is something that we should be willing to pay some price for.
All of that's wonderful. I agree with it. And I don't say that to be dismissive. I say that to endorse the values and the virtues of this that you've just delineated. My point is, however, if the Saudi Arabians want to normalize relations with the State of Israel, they ought to do it in a manner that is normal, that is typical, and it should not be undertaken in a manner that requires that the State of Israel partitions itself, divides itself up from itself, expels close to 250,000 individuals from Judea and Samaria. They have no right whatsoever to demand any change to the status of Jerusalem. The status of Jerusalem is something that any sensible party should view as sacrosanct. It should be and remain the undivided capital of the State of Israel. And I'm sorry, and this will turn to our next topic, but normalizations, peace between nations, relationships of friendship, those may come, but they may also go. And I do not want to know a state of Israel absent its defensible borders in the case that relationships with the Saudis should turn sour one day. I mean, we already have. I know that you lay the blame for this most squarely, maybe not exclusively, but most squarely at the feet of the Israelis, but we already have a very clear pause in the warmth of the relationship between the signatories to the Abraham Accords, including Israel and the UAE. We haven't seen a repeat of the Negev Forum. We've seen that these are being stress tested by way of the current coalition and its policies with regards to the Palestinian Arabs. I don't believe that these normalization treaties are to be trusted. I think that they should be entered into, but the idea that we would sacrifice our presence in Judea and Samaria, our presence in Jerusalem, and who knows what else will next be demanded, that's not a normal set of demands for the purpose of normalization. Those are distinctly abnormal demands, and the Israeli government would be abnormal were it to accept such demands. That's my personal view. And speaking of relationships that have soured and been warm and soured again, and now might be thawing a little bit, I want to turn to Erdogan and the meeting that Prime Minister Netanyahu is having with him, or has just had with him, on the sidelines at the United Nations. Because, Chuck, I know that these two leaders have a very long history with one another, and I was rather surprised, I'll confess, to learn that they'd never actually met in person. But here they are in New York at the United Nations doing precisely that. And to give a little bit of context, in 2009 at a panel in Davos, Switzerland, Erdogan actually stormed off the stage. I'd encourage anybody to go and YouTube that. He stormed off the stage. He was sitting next to, or just a seat along from, then Israeli President Shimon Peres. And he did so amidst a tirade of abuse and opprobrium and accusation aimed at Peres and the State of Israel in the wake of the events of Operation Cast Lead, Israel's defensive operation inside the Gaza Strip, the first operation of what I view as being a series of volleys of inconclusive operations by the Israel Defense Forces within the Gaza Strip. Cast Lead, incidentally, was very wisely timed to take place during the lame duck period between George W. Bush's departure from the Oval Office and the commencement of the Obama administration. And we, in addition to this event on the stage in Davos, we all remember the incident of the Mavi Marmara in 2010. I believe it was in May 2010, a ship that sought to dock at the Gaza Strip in violation of the Israeli naval blockade, a blockade which incidentally is also enforced by Egypt. It's important to mention that ship, the Mavi Marmara, was interdicted by the Israeli Navy. Israeli naval commandos rappelled down onto that ship from a helicopter. Those commandos were then clubbed, beaten, assailed, and assaulted. And only then did they deploy live fire against those aboard the ship who sought to harm them. And in March 2013, Barack Obama pressed Bibi Netanyahu to make a telephonic apology to Erdogan just before he departed, which Prime Minister Netanyahu actually ended up doing, not to any particularly warm relationships as a result of that. It should be mentioned that the IDF and Turkish forces used to regularly undergo joint exercises and more. Tell us about this relationship between Erdogan and Netanyahu. What were some of its high points and where were the low points, Chuck, other than those that I just spoke about?
Yeah. Before I do that, I just have to go back one or 2 points on the previous topics. First of all, the Saudis never said that Israel has to do any one of the specific things that you mentioned. Actually, they haven't, at least publicly, they have not specified what they want on the Palestinian issue, other than to say that it has to be some sort of significant concession. And that doesn't have to be territorial. It might be, for example, a suspension of settlement. It might be a formal commitment not to continue settlements or not to annex for the 5 years. I think that's actually what they're 5 years, 10 years indefinitely. I think that's what they're interested in most at the moment. Probably not Jerusalem, probably not territory at this point. But just to go back briefly to the meeting between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Biden today. So we mentioned the quadrilateral deal between the U.S., the Saudis, Israel, and the Palestinians about normalization and the other things that accompany this idea. Not surprisingly, the two sides will talk about Iran, what's happening there, and the Iranians being ever closer to a nuclear capability. Just in the last week, the U.S. and Iran concluded a deal for mutual release of hostages, and the U.S. is releasing $6 billion in funds, and that is something that can be criticized, buying off the release of innocent hostages. On the other hand, let me remind people that Prime Minister Netanyahu released 1,000 terrorists, many with a lot of blood on their hands, absolute murderers, in exchange for one Israeli soldier. So one can debate who's the more stalwart leader or who's taking the tougher.
Hold on, just to clarify, because you said that the exchange for $6 billion for the prisoners is something for which Netanyahu can be criticized. Of course, Biden can be criticized, right?
Oh, okay, sorry, maybe I misspoke. Of course, Biden can be misspoken, but the point is, for example, that Netanyahu released 1,000 prisoners in exchange for one Israeli soldier. So we all pay heavy prices in these kinds of situations. And I don't think either decision was the right one. He also wants to raise the...
Wait a moment. I'm sorry. I want to just get you on this. So you don't think either decision was the right one. Tell me why you don't think Netanyahu's decision to release these murderers in exchange for Gilad Shalit was the right one. I'd like people to hear that from you, if you would talk about that just for a moment. I also was not in favor of that, but I'd like to hear from you.
Look, on a purely personal and normative level, as far as I'm concerned, we could have paid 10 million to one, because there's the life of any Israeli soldier is something that we cannot measure in any other form, not in numbers, and it's getting our guys back. The problem is that in some ways, unpleasant world that we live in, if you release 1,000 soldiers, you've now for one guy, you've now set a new baseline that Hamas, for example, ever since, because they have a couple of the bodies of a couple of Israeli soldiers, and they have 3 Israeli civilians who actually crossed into Gaza of their own volition, 2 of whom are apparently have some mental challenges. So Israel shouldn't even have to take responsibility for them. It's not as if there are soldiers who we sent in there, but we don't want to leave our people in Hamas control. And so Hamas has said, well, if you guys paid 1,000 for one soldier, we should get at least that much for each of these 3. And I don't think we should. You have to make some compromise with terror at times, but 1,000 to 1 is just totally unacceptable. This is 5 to 1, okay, 10 to 1. I don't know where the exact cutoff point is. It's certainly not 1,000 to 1. I think that was a grossly misguided decision on the part of the prime minister, and I hope we don't do it again.
Well, thank you. That's interesting that you say that. I did want people to hear that, because I think that people fail to understand your viewpoints and just how nuanced it is on any number of issues. Sometimes, people think that, well, if Chuck Freilich is a proponent of the 2-state solution, he must be a dove on every single issue. Things have become so polarized and so completely populist in terms of how things are messaged and the conclusions people draw. And I know you, and I know that that's not the case about you. And I just wanted people to hear from you in your own words. Now, we're limited for time, unfortunately, Chuck. Do you want to address yourself to Erdogan and the relationship there before we conclude?
Sure. Look, Erdogan has been either the prime minister or now the president of Turkey since November 2002, so it's 21 years. He almost on the turn of a dime, after assuming power in 2002, took what was a close strategic relationship between Turkey and Israel, a relationship that was it was hyped a bit. It wasn't a strategic alliance in the way that some of the newspaper headlines at the time said, but the fact that they could come out with headlines like that did reflect a reality, which is a very close relationship. The first Muslim state to have formal diplomatic relations with Israel. And in the 90s and until he takes over in 2002, it's not just a strong economic relationship and a very strong diplomatic relationship, it's a very strong military relationship. Lots of Israeli arms sales to the Turks, including for them to be able to then manufacture the weapons in Turkey, in strong intelligence cooperation, allowing the Israeli Air Force to overfly Turkish territory, to conduct exercises over their territory. Some people speaking of the Turks possibly allowing Israel to conduct an attack against Iran if and when it happened from Turkish territory. That may have been beyond what was really happening. But there was a very close relationship. Erdogan comes in, he's the head of the Islamist party, and overnight the relationship takes a nosedive. Then along comes the flotilla incident in 2010 that you mentioned. And again, some people put the blame on Israel. We overreacted. Nonsense. This was an intentional provocation on the part of the Turks, on the part of the Turkish government. They did it in such a way that they knew that Israel would have to respond with force. And the actual operation was not conducted effectively. That's where we failed in this. And some people were killed. But then when that happened, Turkey turned it into a big incident that we then have to atone for. We shouldn't have had to. In this case, I support the fact that we did it because it didn't really cost us anything other than a little bit of self-pride. And I think we're strong enough sometimes to swallow a little bit of that. And that then was the basis for Erdogan agreeing in his great graciousness to renew talks with Israel and subsequently to renew ties. The one thing that has remained constant during this period is the strong economic ties. The diplomatic ties are very problematic. The Turks are very, it's not even a matter of being critical of Israel, that you can be, but they are extreme. Their rhetoric is truly heinous. And Erdogan's policies killed any military relationship. There's essentially nothing today. So maybe if they're meeting and maybe some good could come of it, but it's going to be a long time before we have a really good relationship with Turkey once again. And it's a very important state in the region.
Yeah, I think that Erdogan also revealed himself as being that worst of all things, Chuck, that a double-dyed anti-Semite. I mean, this was somebody whose rhetoric strayed way beyond criticism of the state of Israel's policies into clear and unveiled Jew hatred and anti-Semitism. And I'm sure that Prime Minister Netanyahu, and frankly, any sensible or sane Prime Minister of the State of Israel will be informed by that as they start to perhaps rebuild some semblance of a relationship with Turkey. But it's again one of those states where relationships should not be trusted and daily verified, I think, to play on the phrase of Ronald Reagan. I will tell you one interesting thing about this, which is that during his address to the UN General Assembly over the years, Erdogan has regularly railed against the state of Israel, regularly and publicly and with increasing vitriol. But this year he was rather measured in his comments about Israel. He actually said from that famous podium in front of the Green Wall, that iconic Green Wall, he said, quote, "In order for peace to ring in the Middle East, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict should be brought to an eventual solution. We will continue to support the Palestinian people in their struggle for legitimate rights under international law. It is difficult for Israel to find the peace and security it seeks in that part of the world. We will continue to pursue respect for the historic status of Jerusalem." Now, there's much in there that I don't like. There's much in there that I don't appreciate, don't approve of. But it's far more measured, isn't it? It's far more measured language than we've come to expect from this individual. I wonder if he's just looking at the state of the board and seeing the run that's at play and saying, you know what, I'd better somehow get on the right side of dynamics here. If this Saudi-Israel normalization is happening, I'd better not be a voice in the wilderness. What say you to that? Do you think that's playing into all this? I think it probably is, right?
I fully agree that that's playing into it. And I would not attribute too much goodwill to him. This was maybe a one-off, somehow a mistake on his part to speak moderately. He really is an anti-Semite at heart. He is.
Yeah, and on that happy note, Chuck, I'm afraid that we're going to have to conclude our conversation today for the IDDF podcast. I really appreciate you twisting my arm and making me speak about the Oslo Accords with you today. It's not something that I actually wanted to do, but you convinced me of its virtue, and I've learned a lot about it, and I appreciate you giving us the opportunity, the two of us, to air our different perspectives on this together publicly, hopefully for the interest of the listeners. And I'm looking forward to the next episode here at the IDDF podcast, and I wish you well, Chuck. And don't forget, we're going to be on the road soon enough. You and I, we've got IDDF lives lined up in Boston, Los Angeles, New York, and New Jersey, and there are going to be more of those as the semester runs on. And yes, Chuck, I promise to let you know of exactly when and where those events will be taking place, because you're 50% of the duo, and I'm looking forward to it, and I hope our audience will enjoy engaging with us as well.
So I enjoyed the conversation also, and the agreements, the disagreements. And I'm looking forward to all of those meetings and to also knowing when they will be taking place. To wish our listeners, those who will be fasting and those who will not be fasting, an easy Yom Kippur, and again a Shana Tova, Gemar Chatima Tova, and we will speak again in 2 weeks.
Thanks, Chuck. All the very best. Take care.